Where did you steal this card? The question echoed across the marble lobby of Sterling Heritage Trust so loudly that every conversation stopped. Customers turned away from the teller windows, employees lifted their heads from their computer screens, and dozens of eyes settled on a 12-year-old girl standing alone at the front counter. Emma Brooks tightened her grip on the worn manila envelope she had carried all morning. Her sweater had been washed so many times that the color had faded into a pale gray, and strips of silver tape held the front of her sneakers together. She noticed people looking at her clothes before they looked at her face, but she had promised herself she wouldn't cry. She took a slow breath before answering. I didn't steal it, sir. My mother gave it to me. Robert Hayes, the branch manager, held the black bank card between two fingers as though it didn't belong in the hands of someone like Emma. A faint smile spread across his face before he turned toward the waiting customers. Do you know what kind of card this is? He asked loudly enough for everyone to hear. People spend years building fortunes before they're invited to carry one of these. A few customers chuckled. Someone near the back of the line quietly shook his head. Robert looked back at Emma. And you're asking me to believe that your mother left this to you? Yes, sir. When did she give it to you? A few days before she passed away. For the briefest moment, the room became quiet. Emma hoped that would change everything. Instead, Robert leaned comfortably against the counter and folded his arms. I'm sorry for your loss, he said, though there wasn't a trace of sympathy in his voice. But grief doesn't make impossible stories become true. Emma carefully placed the envelope on the counter. My lawyer told me to bring these papers with the card. He said everything you need is inside. Robert didn't even look at the envelope. He pushed it gently back toward her with one finger. I don't need paperwork to recognize a scam. Emma stared at the unopened envelope. It contained her birth certificate, legal documents prepared by attorney Andrew Collins, and the final instructions her mother had left behind. Grace Brooks had spent hours organizing every page while she still had enough strength to write. Emma remembered that afternoon more clearly than anything else. Her mother had been sitting beside the hospital window, wrapped in a light blanket while autumn rain tapped softly against the glass. She had taken the black card from a small wooden box and placed it carefully into Emma's hands. One day you'll walk into Sterling Heritage, Grace had whispered. When that day comes, don't be afraid if people judge you before they know your story. Emma had frowned. Why would they do that? Her mother smiled sadly. Because sometimes people notice clothes before they notice character. She gently brushed Emma's hair behind her ear. Promise me something. I promise. No matter what anyone says, never let another person's opinion decide your value. Emma had nodded. It was the last promise she ever made to her mother. Now, standing inside the bank, she could still hear those words as clearly as if Grace were standing beside her. She looked back at Robert and quietly said, Could you please check the account? That's all I came here for. Robert laughed, not loudly, but just enough for the people nearby to hear. Young lady, if this card were real, someone like you wouldn't be carrying it inside a backpack. More laughter drifted through the lobby. Emma felt her cheeks grow warm, but she refused to look away. Across the room, a security officer named Michael Foster had been watching from the moment Emma entered the building. What troubled him wasn't the girl's appearance. It wasn't even the unusual bank card. It was the fact that Robert had never scanned the card. He had never asked for identification. He had never opened the legal envelope. He hadn't followed a single verification procedure. He had simply looked at a child's worn shoes, and decided who she was. Michael quietly reached into his jacket and unlocked a secure company phone that only a handful of employees were authorized to use. He typed 3 short words. She's here. Alone. He pressed send. Less than 10 seconds later, a reply appeared. Keep her there. A second message followed almost immediately. I'm on my way. Michael slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked once more toward Emma. She stood alone beneath the bright lights of the lobby, surrounded by strangers who had already made up their minds without asking a single question. She had no idea someone was coming. She had no idea her mother's greatest secret was only minutes away from changing her life forever. She only knew she had made a promise. And no matter how embarrassed she felt, she wasn't leaving that bank until she kept it. There is something I've learned after listening to countless family stories through the years. The strongest people are rarely the loudest ones in the room. More often, they are the ones who continue standing with quiet dignity after the world has already decided they don't belong. Sometimes courage isn't found in winning an argument. Sometimes courage is simply refusing to walk away from the truth, even when you're standing there all alone. Robert rested both hands on the marble counter and looked at Emma with the kind of smile that wasn't friendly at all. It was the smile of someone who had already reached a conclusion and no longer felt the need to look at the evidence. "Let me ask you one simple question," he said. "Where is this lawyer who supposedly told you to come here?" Emma held the envelope close to her chest before answering. "Mr. Collins couldn't come with me today. He said everything you need is inside these papers." Robert barely glanced at the envelope. "I've already told you I don't need to read it. But my mom wanted you to." "I'm sure she did." Emma swallowed the lump in her throat. "She said this bank would help me." Robert sighed as though his patience had finally run out. "Young lady, banks help customers. They don't help people who walk in carrying stories." Emma looked at him quietly. "I'm not asking you to believe my story. I'm only asking you to check." The simplicity of her answer made several customers glance toward Robert. For a brief second, he seemed uncomfortable, but the feeling disappeared almost immediately. Instead, he picked up the black card again and slowly turned it over in his hand. "This card belongs to our Sovereign Legacy program," he announced, making sure everyone nearby could hear him. "Do you know how many people in this state qualify for one?" "Almost none." He looked back at Emma. "So tell me, how did your mother get it?" Emma answered honestly. "I don't know." "You don't know?" "No. She never talked about money." A few people in line exchanged puzzled looks. Robert laughed softly. "Of course she didn't." Emma lowered her eyes. "My mom was sick." The laughter stopped. "For a long time?" Emma nodded. "Almost 3 years. She was a painter. When she couldn't paint anymore, she sold almost everything we owned." Her voice remained calm, but every word carried the quiet weight of memories she wished she didn't have. "We moved into a small apartment over a laundromat. I helped her make dinner. I read to her when she was too tired to read by herself. And every night before I went to sleep, she told me the same thing." Robert crossed his arms. "What was that?" Emma looked at the black card still lying on the counter. "She said there would come a day when I had to be brave all by myself." No one laughed this time. Even Linda Cooper looked away for a moment. Emma continued speaking, not because she wanted sympathy, but because she wanted someone to understand why she was still standing there. "The day before she passed away, she put this card into my hand and said, 'Don't spend your life trying to prove your value to people who judge too quickly. Just tell the truth, and let the truth do the rest.'" Robert gave a small shake of his head. "It's a touching story. But stories aren't evidence." Emma quietly pushed the envelope toward him once again. "Then please read the evidence." For the second time, Robert refused to touch it. Across the lobby, Michael Foster watched every second of the exchange. The longer he observed, the more troubled he became. This wasn't about a suspicious transaction anymore. This was about something much simpler. A child had arrived with legal documents, a government-issued identification card, and a bank card that had never even been scanned. Yet the manager had already decided the outcome. Michael had spent 22 years working security inside financial institutions, and he knew one rule every employee learned during training. Verify first. Judge later. Robert had reversed the order. Michael's phone vibrated once inside his jacket. He glanced down without drawing attention. The message contained only 4 words. 2 minutes. Stay calm. Michael slipped the phone away and looked toward the main entrance. Emma followed his eyes without realizing it. She didn't know why. She couldn't explain it. But for the first time since walking into the bank, she felt the strange feeling that someone, somewhere, had finally decided to listen. The lobby had grown unusually quiet. Even the sound of keyboards had faded as employees pretended to work while secretly watching the little girl at the front counter. Emma stood exactly where she had been standing for nearly 20 minutes, holding the envelope her mother had prepared so carefully before she died. She didn't understand why no one would simply open it. To her, the solution seemed so simple. Read the documents. Check the account. Tell her whether her mother had been telling the truth. Instead, every minute seemed to make Robert Hayes more impatient. He glanced at his watch before speaking again. I think we've spent enough time on this. Emma looked up. I only need a few minutes. You've already had them. I haven't even been checked. Robert forced another smile, though this one was noticeably thinner than before. Young lady, there isn't anything to check. Emma pointed gently toward the computer behind the counter. How do you know? The question caught Robert off guard. I beg your pardon? You haven't looked. For the first time that morning, a few customers exchanged uncomfortable glances. The child wasn't arguing. She wasn't raising her voice. She was simply stating something everyone in the room had quietly noticed. Robert had never touched his keyboard. He straightened his tie before answering. Experience. I've worked in banking for 15 years. I know what I'm looking at. Emma nodded politely. My mom used to say experience helps people make better decisions. Robert smiled. She was right. But she also said good people never stop checking, because sometimes experience can make us too confident. The sentence landed harder than Emma intended. Several employees looked down at their desks. Robert's smile disappeared. You seem to have an answer for everything. Emma shook her head. No, sir. I only remember what my mom taught me. Before Robert could respond, the main entrance quietly opened. A man wearing a charcoal overcoat stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and paused for just a moment to take in the room. There was nothing flashy about him. No security team. No expensive watch displayed for attention. No announcement. He simply looked around as though he had walked into an ordinary bank on an ordinary morning. Michael Foster noticed him immediately. Without speaking, Michael gave the slightest nod. The man understood. He didn't walk toward the manager's office. He didn't ask for assistance. Instead, he remained near the entrance, watching. His eyes settled on Emma. He noticed the taped shoes. The oversized sweater. The envelope pressed tightly against her chest. Then he noticed something else. No documents had been opened. No scanner had been used. No customer verification screen was visible. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. Back at the counter, Robert finally lost what little patience he had left. I'm done discussing this. He turned toward the security desk. James. The younger security guard immediately stepped forward. Yes, Mr. Hayes. Please escort this young lady outside. James hesitated. He looked at Emma. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't causing a disturbance. She was simply standing there. Sir. Robert interrupted. That's an instruction. James walked toward Emma with an apologetic expression. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Let's step outside, and maybe we can call your aunt. Emma didn't move. She wasn't refusing because she wanted to make a scene. She stayed because of a promise. My mom asked me to finish this. James spoke gently. I understand. No. Emma answered softly. I don't think anyone here does. Those words hung in the air for several long seconds. Then another voice broke the silence. I think she deserves 5 more minutes. Everyone turned. The man in the charcoal overcoat had finally stepped forward. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. There was something about the calm confidence in the way he spoke that made the entire room instinctively stop and listen. Robert looked at him politely, assuming he was simply another customer. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, sir. We'll be with you shortly." The man smiled faintly. "I didn't come here to be served." He looked at Emma before finishing his sentence. "I came here because someone asked me to listen." The man in the charcoal overcoat walked toward the counter without the slightest hint of urgency. He wasn't trying to take control of the room. He simply carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime making difficult decisions without ever needing to raise his voice. As he stopped beside Emma, he offered her a warm smile that immediately felt different from every expression she had seen since entering the bank. "May I see the card?" he asked gently. Emma looked at him for a moment before placing the black card into his hand. "Thank you," she said softly. Unlike Robert, the man didn't hold the card up for everyone to see. He examined it carefully, turning it over once before placing it on the counter beside the unopened envelope. Then he asked the question no one else had asked all morning. "May I read the documents your mother left for you?" Emma nodded immediately. "That's why I brought them." The man opened the envelope with surprising care, almost as though he were afraid of damaging the papers inside. He removed the first document, followed by another, then another. Birth records. Legal certifications. A notarized trust document. Everything had been prepared with remarkable precision. He paused when he reached a folded handwritten note resting beneath the legal papers. For just a second, his fingers stopped moving. He recognized the handwriting. He didn't say anything. Instead, he carefully folded the note again and returned it to the envelope without letting anyone else see its contents. Robert finally stepped forward. "Sir, those are confidential customer documents." The man looked at him calmly. "They certainly are. If you aren't the assigned banker, I'd appreciate it if you returned them." The stranger smiled politely. "I will. But first I'd like to ask you a few questions." Robert folded his arms. "I'm listening. When this young lady walked into your branch, did you verify her identification?" "No." "Did you scan her card?" "No." "Did you access the customer database?" "No." The man nodded slowly. "And did you review the legal documents she was instructed to bring?" Robert's expression tightened. "I didn't believe they were necessary." For the first time, the stranger's smile disappeared. "I see." He turned toward Emma. "Did anyone ask your name before deciding you didn't belong here?" Emma quietly shook her head. "No, sir." The man lowered his eyes for a brief moment, as though trying to hide the disappointment he suddenly felt. Then he looked toward the secure workstations behind the counter. "Would someone please bring me an executive terminal?" Linda Cooper frowned. "I'm sorry, but only senior management has access to those systems." Before she could say another word, Michael Foster calmly walked past her. "I'll get one." Robert stared at him in disbelief. "Michael, stay where you are." Michael didn't stop walking. Within seconds he returned, rolling a secure workstation normally reserved for executive audits. Robert's voice became noticeably sharper. "You don't have authorization to use that terminal." Michael met his eyes without hesitation. "No. I don't." He looked toward the man standing beside Emma. "But he does." The stranger sat down, inserted the black card into the reader, and entered a long security code from memory. The system immediately unlocked several menus that no one else in the branch had ever seen before. Robert's confidence began to fade. The customers sensed it too. The room had become so quiet that the faint clicking of the keyboard echoed across the lobby. The man entered only 2 words. Grace Brooks. The first search returned nothing. Robert let out a small breath. "I told you. There isn't an account." The stranger didn't respond. Instead, he opened another database hidden beneath the standard customer records, entered the same name a second time, and waited. The loading symbol remained on the screen for several seconds before a secure notification finally appeared. Executive authorization required. Private Legacy Trust. Contact William Carter immediately. The man read the message without changing his expression. Then, very slowly, he closed the laptop. Robert looked confused. What does that mean? The stranger lifted his eyes and answered in the same calm voice he had used from the moment he arrived. It means this little girl came to exactly the right place. None of the people standing in the lobby understood what he meant. Emma didn't understand either. But as she looked into the stranger's eyes, she noticed something no one else seemed to see. They were beginning to fill with tears. The quiet in the lobby felt heavier than before. No one understood why the stranger had become emotional after seeing a simple system message, but everyone sensed that something important had just happened. Emma stood beside him without speaking. She didn't know who he was, yet for reasons she couldn't explain, she no longer felt alone. Robert cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. Sir, whatever this legacy trust is, it still doesn't change the fact that this child cannot access anything until her identity is verified. The man turned toward him and gave a small nod. For the first time this morning, you've said something completely correct. Robert looked relieved. So we're in agreement. We are. The stranger smiled gently before continuing. Which makes me wonder why identity verification wasn't the very first thing you did when she walked through your doors. Robert opened his mouth, but no answer came. The man continued in the same calm voice. She presented a bank card. She brought legal documents. She stated exactly why she came. Yet you chose not to verify a single one of those things. He paused for just a moment. You made a conclusion before you gathered the facts. The words hung in the air. No one in the lobby moved. No one looked away. Emma quietly watched the stranger as though she were trying to remember where she had seen him before, although she knew they had never met. Robert finally forced a smile. I was protecting the bank. The stranger shook his head. No. You were protecting your assumption. He picked up the envelope once more and carefully arranged every document into its original order before handing it back to Emma. Your mother prepared these beautifully. Emma smiled for the first time that morning. She planned everything. I can see that. The stranger looked down at the handwriting on the envelope for another brief moment. So like Grace, he whispered almost to himself. Emma looked surprised. You knew my mom? He lifted his eyes and smiled. Yes. I knew her a long time ago. What was she like? The question caught him completely off guard. He looked out through the tall windows for a second before answering. She believed that kindness mattered even when nobody was watching. Emma's smile grew a little wider. She told me that too. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Robert interrupted once again. Sir, if you've finished, I'd appreciate knowing exactly who you are. The stranger reached inside his overcoat. Several employees instinctively leaned forward. He wasn't reaching for a wallet. He wasn't searching for business cards. Instead, he removed a slim leather credential holder and placed it quietly on the marble counter. He opened it without saying a word. Robert glanced down. His face immediately turned pale. Linda Cooper stepped closer to read the identification. Her hand instinctively covered her mouth. James looked from the badge to the stranger, then quickly straightened his posture. Even the customers nearest the counter fell completely silent. The silver credential displayed only a few lines. William Carter. Chairman. Sterling Heritage Financial Group. Robert's lips moved, but no sound came out. William calmly closed the credential holder and slipped it back into his pocket. I believe, he said quietly, it's time we stop guessing. He looked directly at Robert. Open the secure account system. Robert stood frozen. I. William's voice remained perfectly calm. That wasn't a request. As Robert slowly walked toward his computer with trembling hands, Emma looked up at William, still trying to understand why everyone in the bank suddenly seemed terrified of the man who had been the first person all morning to treat her with kindness. She had no idea that the greatest mystery of her mother's life had not been the bank account. It was the man now standing quietly beside her, watching over her exactly as Grace Brooks had once hoped he would. Robert's hands shook as he signed into the executive banking system. The confidence that had filled his voice only a few minutes earlier had completely disappeared, replaced by the uneasy silence of a man who suddenly realized he had made a mistake far larger than he first imagined. William stood beside Emma without saying a word. He wasn't interested in embarrassing anyone. He was interested in seeing the truth, exactly as it was, without assumptions and without shortcuts. "Search the Legacy Trust database," William said calmly. Robert swallowed before typing. The secure system requested William's authorization code once again. William stepped forward, entered the code himself, and nodded toward the monitor. "Continue." The loading icon spun across the screen. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. The lobby was so quiet that the clicking of Robert's keyboard echoed against the marble walls. Finally, the account appeared. Grace Brooks Legacy Trust. Primary beneficiary, Emma Brooks. Robert stared at the screen as though he could will the words to disappear. William's voice remained steady. "Read the balance." Robert looked at him. "Sir." "Read it." His throat tightened. "Current available balance." He stopped and blinked twice. William didn't move. "Louder, please." Robert took a slow breath before forcing himself to continue. "Current available balance, $4,872,316.41. A quiet gasp swept through the lobby. The same people who had laughed at Emma only moments earlier now stood frozen in disbelief. Several customers instinctively looked toward the little girl in the oversized sweater and worn shoes, as though seeing her for the first time. Emma wasn't looking at the balance. Her eyes were fixed on one line near the top of the screen. Grace Brooks. She smiled softly, and tears slowly filled her eyes. "My mom kept her promise," she whispered. William looked at Emma instead of the millions of dollars displayed on the monitor. "Yes," he said gently. "She certainly did." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then William turned toward Robert. "When Emma walked into this branch this morning, did you ask for her identification?" Robert lowered his eyes. "No." "Did you examine the legal documents prepared by her attorney?" "No." "Did you scan her bank card before accusing her of fraud?" "No." "Did you search a single banking database before deciding she was lying?" Robert's voice had become almost inaudible. "No." William nodded slowly. "So before you read one document, before you verified one fact, before you followed one procedure, you had already decided this child didn't belong here." No one attempted to defend Robert. There was nothing left to defend. William slowly looked around the lobby, making eye contact with employees and customers alike. This little girl never asked for special treatment. She never demanded favors. She asked for something every customer deserves the moment they walk through these doors. He paused, allowing the silence to settle over the room. She asked to be treated fairly. His voice remained calm, but every word carried quiet conviction. The greatest mistake made here today wasn't failing to recognize a multimillion-dollar account. He looked toward Emma before finishing his sentence. It was failing to recognize the dignity of a grieving child. Those words settled over the room with a weight no one could ignore. Several employees quietly lowered their heads. James looked toward the floor. Even Linda Cooper could no longer meet Emma's eyes. At that moment, Emma finally understood something her mother had tried to teach her years before. Money hadn't changed the way people looked at her. The truth had. And sometimes, the truth arrives quietly, asking nothing more than the chance to be heard. Sometimes, we spend so much time wondering who is wealthy, successful, or important that we forget a far more meaningful question. Are we treating the person standing in front of us with the kindness they deserve before we know anything about them? Grace Brooks understood that lesson long before anyone inside this bank did. The measure of our character is never revealed by how we greet the powerful. It is revealed by how we treat the person everyone else has already decided to overlook. William allowed the silence to linger for a few moments before speaking again. He had spent decades leading one of the country's largest financial institutions, and he had learned that the most important lessons were rarely delivered through anger. They were delivered through truth. He turned toward Robert, whose shoulders were now slumped in quiet defeat. "I want you to answer one final question," William said. "When Emma first walked through these doors, what was the very first thing you noticed?" Robert hesitated. Then he answered honestly. "Her clothes." William nodded. "And what was the second thing?" Robert looked at Emma before lowering his eyes again. "I never got that far." William didn't respond immediately. Instead, he slowly looked around the lobby, making sure every employee was listening. "That is exactly how prejudice works," he said. "It convinces us we've already learned everything we need to know before we've asked a single question." The words settled heavily over the room. Linda Cooper quietly wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. James stood near the entrance with his hands folded in front of him, wishing he had spoken up sooner. Even several customers who had laughed earlier now looked deeply uncomfortable. Emma remained beside William, still holding the envelope that her mother had prepared with such care. She looked up at him. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "How did you know my mom?" The question caught everyone by surprise. William smiled gently. "We met many years ago." "Were you friends?" He looked at Emma for a long moment before answering. "We were much more than friends." Emma tilted her head slightly, trying to understand what he meant, but William wasn't ready to say more. "Not here. Not with dozens of strangers listening." Instead, he asked a question of his own. "Do you still have the handwritten letter your mother left inside the envelope?" Emma nodded. "I haven't opened it." "Why not?" "Mr. Collins told me it wasn't meant to be read until someone from the bank asked for it." William's eyes softened. "Your mother always thought ahead." He took a slow breath before continuing. "I think it's time we read it together." Emma looked surprised. "Together?" "Yes." Before either of them could take another step, Robert spoke again. "Mr. Carter." William turned toward him. "I owe Emma an apology." William looked at the little girl standing beside him. "That decision belongs to her." Robert slowly walked around the counter until he stood directly in front of Emma. His voice was no longer proud or defensive. "I'm sorry. I judged you before I knew anything about you. I never read your documents. I never gave you the chance you deserved. I forgot that my job was to serve every customer fairly." Emma listened quietly. She remembered every painful word he had spoken that morning, but she also remembered something her mother had repeated countless times. "Kindness isn't tested when people are nice to you," Grace used to say. "It's tested when they aren't." Emma took a small breath before answering. "I accept your apology." Robert looked relieved for a moment. Then Emma added gently, "But I hope the next little girl who walks into this bank won't need someone else to prove she's worth listening to." No one in the room could have said it better. William felt an overwhelming sense of pride, not because of the money Grace had left behind, but because of the young woman she had raised. In that single sentence, Emma had shown more wisdom than many adults spend a lifetime learning. William smiled warmly. "I think your mother would be very proud of you." Emma looked up at him. "I hope so." William offered her his hand. "Come with me." "Where are we going?" "Somewhere quiet. There are things your mother wanted you to know." Emma slipped her small hand into his. Without realizing it, she had just taken the first step toward discovering that the greatest secret Grace Brooks had protected for 12 years wasn't hidden inside a trust account. It was waiting inside a letter, and inside the heart of the man now walking beside her. William led Emma into a quiet conference room overlooking the river. The sounds of the busy banking floor disappeared as the door closed behind them, leaving only the soft hum of the building's air conditioning. For the first time that morning, Emma felt as though she could finally breathe. William waited until they were both seated before placing Grace's envelope gently on the table between them. "Your mother left one letter that wasn't meant for the bank," he said softly. "It was meant for us." Emma looked at him with surprise. "For us?" William nodded. Attorney Collins knew exactly when to hand it over. Emma slowly pushed the envelope toward him. "I think Mom wanted you to read it first." William unfolded the letter with careful hands. The moment he saw Grace's familiar handwriting, he closed his eyes for a second. 12 years had passed since he had last received anything written by the woman he had loved, yet every letter looked exactly the same. The graceful curves of her handwriting instantly brought back memories he had spent years trying not to revisit. He began reading silently. The first few lines made him smile. The next few made his eyes fill with tears. Emma watched him quietly. She had never seen a grown man become so emotional while reading a letter. After several long moments, William carefully folded the paper and rested both hands on the table. "Your mother was extraordinary," he said. Emma smiled. "I know." William laughed softly. "Yes, you do." Emma hesitated before asking the question that had been quietly growing inside her heart ever since he arrived at the bank. "Did you really know her that well?" William looked at Grace's letter again. "I knew her better than anyone." He took a slow breath. "We were young when we met. We didn't have much. But we believed we could build a beautiful life together." Emma listened without interrupting. "Then life became more complicated than either of us expected. There were misunderstandings, difficult decisions, and more time apart than either of us ever wanted." He paused. "But there was never a day when I stopped caring about your mother." Emma looked down at her hands. "I wish I could remember more about when she was healthy." William smiled gently. "She laughed every time she got paint on her nose." Emma laughed through her tears. "She still did that. She believed every sunflower deserved to face the morning sun." Emma nodded. "She told me flowers are brave because they always look toward the light." William smiled again. "That sounds exactly like Grace." Silence settled comfortably between them. Then Emma asked the question she had been afraid to ask for years. "My mom never talked about my dad." William's smile slowly faded. He reached for the letter once more. "She wrote something about that." Emma's heartbeat quickened. William read aloud. "If Emma is old enough to hear this, then she is old enough to know the truth. Please tell her that she was loved long before she was born, and that every difficult decision I made was made because I believed it would protect her." William stopped reading for a moment before looking directly into Emma's eyes. "Grace never wanted you to believe you had been abandoned." Emma barely whispered. "Then, where was he?" William reached across the table and gently held her trembling hands. "He was closer than you ever imagined." Emma looked at him, searching his face as though a forgotten memory were trying to return. Suddenly she remembered an old photograph she had once found inside her mother's dresser. A young man stood beside Grace in a field of bright yellow sunflowers. She had only seen the picture once before it disappeared, but she had never forgotten his kind eyes. Slowly, almost afraid of the answer, she whispered, "Are you, my father?" William could no longer hold back the tears. He smiled through them and gave the smallest nod. "Yes, Emma. I've been your father from the very first day of your life." For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Emma reached across the table and wrapped her arms around him. William held his daughter as though he were trying to make up for 12 years that could never be lived again. Sometimes we believe the greatest mysteries in life are hidden inside locked vaults, forgotten letters, or fortunes waiting to be discovered. Yet the deepest mystery is often much simpler. It is the quiet hope that love can survive time, distance, and misunderstanding until the day two hearts finally recognize what they have always belonged to. On that afternoon, Emma didn't simply discover who her father was. She discovered that she had never been forgotten. Emma didn't know how long they remained there. Time seemed to lose its meaning as she sat beside the man she had just learned was her father. Neither of them felt the need to rush the conversation. After 12 years of silence, they had finally reached the point where words mattered less than simply being together. William gently unfolded Grace's letter once more. "There are a few more things she wanted us to read together," he said. Emma nodded and quietly listened. William read aloud. "William, if you're holding this letter, then you kept your promise. Thank you for waiting until Emma was old enough to choose her own future instead of having it chosen for her. I know those years will not be easy for either of you, but I also know that love built on truth lasts much longer than love built on fear." William paused, taking a slow breath before continuing. "Emma, if you're reading this beside your father, please don't waste time asking who was right or who was wrong. Life is rarely that simple. Instead, ask whether both of you are willing to love each other from this day forward. That's the only answer that still matters." Neither of them spoke for several moments. Emma finally looked at William. "You really wanted to know me?" William smiled sadly. "Every single day." He reached into his wallet and carefully removed a small, worn photograph. "I've carried this for years." Emma took it gently. It showed a little girl standing proudly beside an easel, holding a blue ribbon after a children's art competition. She looked up in surprise. "I was 7. William nodded. "I was sitting in the last row." "You were there?" "I never missed the moments your mother allowed me to see." Emma turned the photograph over. A date was written on the back in William's handwriting. "I was so proud of you today." Emma felt tears fill her eyes again. "You wrote that?" "I did." She looked at him with quiet disbelief. "Why didn't you give it to me?" William glanced at Grace's letter. "Because I promised your mother I wouldn't step into your life until she believed you were ready." Emma slowly nodded. For the first time, she understood that waiting had been painful for him too. She smiled gently. "I thought nobody came to my school concerts." William laughed softly. "I was always there. You played the violin in 5th grade. I missed one note. You missed 2. Emma laughed. "I knew someone noticed. I noticed everything." The room suddenly felt lighter. The sadness hadn't disappeared, but it was no longer carrying the whole conversation. A gentle knock interrupted the moment. Michael Foster stepped inside. "I'm sorry to interrupt." William looked up. "What is it, Michael?" "The board has completed its emergency meeting. And? The investigation has officially begun." William nodded. "Thank you." Michael hesitated before adding one more sentence. "The employees are asking if they may apologize to Emma before she leaves." William looked toward his daughter. "It's your decision." Emma thought quietly for a few seconds. "I don't need everyone to apologize." William smiled. "No?" She shook her head. "I just hope they remember me the next time another little kid walks through those doors." William felt a quiet sense of pride. Grace had left Emma a trust worth millions of dollars. But sitting beside him was proof that she had left something even more valuable. She had raised a daughter whose first instinct wasn't revenge. It was hope. As William stood and offered Emma his hand, he realized that the hardest chapter of their story had finally come to an end. The next chapter wouldn't be about hidden accounts, unanswered questions, or painful misunderstandings. It would simply be about a father and daughter discovering the ordinary moments they had waited 12 years to share. When William and Emma stepped out of the conference room, the atmosphere inside the branch was completely different from the one they had walked away from less than an hour earlier. The whispers had disappeared. No one was staring anymore. Employees who had once avoided looking at Emma now greeted her with quiet respect, and the customers waiting in line instinctively stepped aside to let her pass. William wasn't interested in making a public spectacle out of what had happened. Justice, in his experience, didn't need an audience. It needed honesty. Susan Mitchell, the regional executive director, arrived with two compliance officers carrying sealed folders. She walked directly toward William. "Mr. Carter, we've completed our preliminary review." William nodded. "What have you confirmed?" Susan opened the folder. "The security recordings match everything Mr. Foster reported. Emma's identification was never requested. Her documents were never examined. The card was never scanned, and no account search was performed before conclusions were made." William wasn't surprised. "What about the staff?" "We've interviewed everyone who was on duty." She paused before continuing. "Several employees admitted they knew proper procedures weren't being followed, but they chose not to speak because Mr. Hayes had managed this branch for many years." William looked around the lobby for a moment before answering. "That may explain their silence." He paused. "But it doesn't excuse it." His voice remained calm, yet every employee understood the weight behind those words. He turned toward the group gathered near the customer service desks. "Every policy this company has ever written can be replaced." He looked from one face to another. "Character cannot." No one interrupted. William continued. "A financial institution isn't built on marble floors or impressive buildings. It's built on trust. Every customer who walks through these doors deserves the same respect before you know anything about their income, their appearance, or the balance in their account." Linda Cooper quietly stepped forward. "Mr. Carter." William looked at her. "I should have spoken up." She glanced toward Emma. "I knew we should have verified her information. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to challenge my manager." Emma looked at Linda for a moment before offering a small smile. "I hope next time you do." Linda nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I will." Near the entrance, James Walker slowly approached Emma. "I owe you an apology too," he said. "I should have asked questions before asking you to leave." Emma smiled kindly. "My mom used to say everyone gets another chance to do the right thing." James smiled for the first time all day. "I won't waste mine." Then Carlos Ramirez, the elderly maintenance worker, walked over holding a small paper cup of hot chocolate from the employee lounge. "I thought you might like this," he said shyly. Emma accepted it with both hands. "Thank you." Carlos smiled. "My granddaughter is about your age. I kept thinking about how I'd want someone to treat her." William watched the exchange quietly. This was the change he had hoped to see. Not fear. Not embarrassment. Understanding. As they prepared to leave, Emma slipped her hand into William's again. She looked back across the lobby one final time. The bank looked exactly the same as it had when she first walked in that morning. The marble floors hadn't changed. The tall windows hadn't changed. The expensive furniture hadn't changed. The people had. And sometimes, William thought as the two of them stepped outside into the afternoon sunshine, that is the most meaningful kind of change a place can ever experience. The weeks that followed marked the beginning of a completely different chapter, not only for Emma and William, but for everyone connected to Sterling Heritage. News of the incident never reached the newspapers because William refused to turn a grieving child into a public story. He believed some lessons were too personal to become headlines, and this was one of them. An internal review was completed within days. Every security recording from that morning was examined. Every employee who had been on duty was interviewed. Every decision was compared against the bank's own policies. The conclusion was unmistakable. Robert Hayes had ignored every required verification procedure before making a judgment about a customer. His years of experience had slowly convinced him that instinct was more reliable than process, and on that morning, that belief had cost him everything he had spent decades building. William never celebrated the outcome. When Susan Mitchell informed him that Robert's employment had officially ended, he simply nodded. "There is no satisfaction in watching someone lose a career," he said quietly. "The real goal is making sure another child never walks through our doors and experiences what Emma did." Susan agreed. Within a month, every Sterling Heritage branch across the country introduced a new customer care program. During the first training session, William stood before hundreds of managers and employees with nothing more than Emma's worn manila envelope in his hands. He held it up for everyone to see. "This envelope," he began, "contains nothing extraordinary. It holds identification, legal documents, and a mother's final wishes for her daughter." Yet none of those pages were ever opened because someone believed appearances had already told the whole story. The room remained completely silent. William slowly placed the envelope on the podium. "If you remember only one lesson from today, remember this. Verification comes before opinion. Respect comes before assumption. Every single customer deserves both." The words became part of the company's official training program. Meanwhile, Emma's life settled into a rhythm she had never imagined possible. Every Saturday morning, William arrived at Aunt Margaret's house exactly at 9 o'clock. Sometimes they visited museums because Emma wanted to learn more about the artists her mother had admired. Other weekends they walked through botanical gardens, where William would quietly point toward the bright rows of sunflowers and smile without saying a word. He never tried to replace the years they had lost. He never demanded that Emma call him Dad. He simply showed up. Week after week. Month after month. Trust, William realized, wasn't built through grand gestures. It was built by keeping ordinary promises. One rainy afternoon, Emma carried an old wooden box into the living room. "I found this while cleaning Aunt Margaret's attic," she said. Inside were dozens of Grace's sketchbooks. William carefully opened the first one. Every page revealed another memory. Portraits. Landscapes. Half-finished paintings. Little notes written in the margins. Near the back of one sketchbook, they found a folded piece of paper tucked between two drawings. Grace's handwriting covered both sides. Emma looked at William. "I've never seen this before." William unfolded it carefully. It wasn't another farewell letter. It was a list. At the top, Grace had written only 6 simple words. "Things I hope Emma learns someday." The first line read, "Choose kindness before certainty." The second read, "Listen longer than you judge." William smiled through quiet tears. "That sounds exactly like your mother." Emma leaned her head gently against his shoulder. "I think she's still teaching us." William nodded. "No." He smiled warmly. "I know she is." 6 years passed more quickly than either of them expected, and the frightened little girl who had once stood alone in the lobby of Sterling Heritage slowly grew into a confident young woman whose quiet strength reminded everyone of Grace Brooks. Emma never allowed money to define her life. The trust her mother had protected gave her opportunities, but it never changed the values Grace had worked so hard to teach her. She continued painting because it made her feel close to her mother, and every canvas filled with bright yellow sunflowers carried memories that no amount of money could ever replace. William often visited her small art studio on Saturday mornings. Sometimes they talked for hours. Sometimes they painted in comfortable silence. Those ordinary afternoons became far more valuable than either of them had imagined because they weren't trying to recover the 12 years they had lost. They were simply making the most of the years they still had. One evening, as they closed the studio together, William asked a question he had wondered about for months. "Have you ever thought about changing your last name?" Emma smiled before locking the door behind her. "You mean becoming Emma Carter?" William nodded. "If you ever wanted to." Emma looked across the street where the evening sun reflected softly against the windows of nearby buildings. "I've thought about it." "And?" She smiled again. "I already have the father I spent my whole childhood hoping to find." William felt his throat tighten. "But Brooks reminds me of the woman who taught me how to become the person I am." William gently squeezed her shoulder. "I think your mother would have loved that answer." Together they established the Grace Brooks Foundation, a charity dedicated to helping young artists, single parents, and children who had lost a parent far too soon. During the very first board meeting, one committee member suggested including applicant photographs with every scholarship application. Emma quietly shook her head. "I'd rather not." The room became silent. "May I ask why?" someone finally said. Emma smiled gently. Because photographs encourage assumptions. I'd rather people be known by their dreams before they're known by their appearance. No one argued. The policy was adopted that very day. Several months later, Emma visited another bank to open a scholarship account for the foundation. She wore blue jeans, a simple sweater, and the same quiet smile she had carried since childhood. Nothing about her appearance suggested that she was responsible for managing millions of dollars in charitable funds. A young teller welcomed her warmly. Good morning. How may I help you today? I'd like to open an account for our foundation. Of course, the teller replied with a smile. May I please see your identification? Every document was reviewed carefully. Every procedure was followed exactly as it should have been. Most importantly, every word was spoken with kindness. When everything was finished, the teller handed the paperwork back and said, "Thank you for choosing us. We hope to see you again soon." Emma thanked her and stepped outside. She paused for a moment before looking back through the glass doors. No one had stared. No one had laughed. No one had decided who she was before learning her name. That simple moment meant more to her than anyone inside the bank could possibly know. Later that afternoon, Emma and William drove to Grace's resting place carrying a bouquet of fresh sunflowers. Emma knelt beside the headstone and gently placed the flowers where the afternoon sunlight could reach them. She smiled softly. You kept every promise, Mom. She looked toward William, who stood quietly a few steps away. And somehow, you helped Dad keep his too. A gentle breeze moved through the trees, and for just a moment the sunflowers swayed together as though someone invisible had brushed lightly against them. William walked over and stood beside his daughter. Neither of them needed to speak. Some endings don't arrive with applause. They arrive with peace. And perhaps that's the greatest reward life can offer. Over the years, I've listened to many family stories, and I've come to believe that the most valuable inheritance is rarely the one protected inside a vault or written into a legal document. The greatest inheritance is a parent's character, quietly passed from one generation to the next through love, patience, and example. Grace Brooks left Emma a remarkable financial gift, but that wasn't the treasure that changed her daughter's life. The real gift was the courage to keep telling the truth when no one believed her, the wisdom to answer cruelty with dignity, and the strength to choose kindness even after experiencing injustice. If there's one lesson worth carrying with us after this story ends, it's this: never decide a person's value before you've taken the time to learn their story. The clothes they wear may tell you where they've been, but only compassion will help you discover who they truly are.